In 1431, a 17-year-old girl was burned at the stake. She was illiterate, a farmer's daughter, and yet somehow she convinced an entire army to follow her into battle. As a child, my father gave me a copy of a game called Jeanne d'Arc for the PSP. But growing up in Southeast Asia, my English was barely good enough to understand what the characters were saying. All I knew at the time was there was a girl who apparently really hated the English. Something about receiving a calling from the heavens, urging her to fight for the sake of France. It tells a tale of a war fought between brothers, of an ancient evil and the magic that binds it. I barely understood any of it as a child, and yet the game was one of the most exciting ones I had ever played. I honest to God loved this game when I was young, but that love only grew when I discovered that it was actually based on a true story. From the burning of Domrémy, the meeting with the Dauphin, the siege of Orléans, and eventually, the moment the maiden was burned at the stake. Behind the fantasy, behind the tale of demons and magic, there was a girl, against all odds, rose to change the course of history. Her name was Joan of Arc, or as the French calls her, Jeanne d'Arc. The game was designed as an RPG centered around the titular character, Jeanne. But for those familiar with history, there are of course no demons or magic in the story of Joan of Arc. So, where did this unusual blend of fantasy and history come from? The answer lies with the studio behind the game, Level 5. A Japanese developer are renowned for crafting some of the most polished games of the 2000s. By the time Jeanne d'Arc entered production, the studio had already built a reputation with titles such as Dragon Quest VIII, Dark Cloud, and the Professor Layton series. The project itself was directed by Ken Motomura, marking one of his first major roles as a director after contributing to animation and visual effects on early Level 5 titles. Interestingly, the production also included Akihiro Hino, the founder and CEO of Level 5 among its producers, suggesting that the project had direct oversight from the studio's leadership. Development began with a small experimental team, which spent roughly 6 months exploring the concept before the full project entered production. Since this will be Level 5's first title on the PSP, the team decided to design the game as a tactical RPG. The developers wanted to strike a balance between accessibility and depth. Their goal was to ensure that newcomers to the genre could still enjoy the game, while longtime strategy fans will find something familiar and satisfying. Revisiting the game years after as an adult, I'll say they hit the nail right on the head. But what truly defined Jeanne d'Arc was its central idea. Rather than telling the historical story exactly as it happened, Level 5 wanted to create a world where history and fantasy existed side by side. The 100 Years' War will remain the foundation, but building upon that foundation was a world where our history melded with fantasy. And yet, beneath all that lay something far stranger. Playing through Jeanne d'Arc again, one thing becomes immediately clear. There really is no other tactical RPG quite like it. Even Fire Emblem, often considered the granddaddy of the tactical RPG genre, struggles to replicate the particular charm that Jeanne d'Arc managed to capture. Part of that charm, however, lies in the way the game presents its story. Animated cutscenes in RPGs weren't exactly rare back in the early 2000s, but what set Jeanne d'Arc apart was its unusual approach to voice acting.
Jeanne, wait! Don't pout. You know Roger is not trying to get rid of you. He cares about you and wants to keep you out of harm's way.
Oh, I am not so sure.
During the auditioning process for the English dub, the developers considered both French and North American voice actors for the cast. But regardless of their background, Every voice actor was instructed to perform their lines with a French accent. A vocal coach was even hired to ensure they'll get the desired result. The outcome was somewhat divisive. For some players, the accents added a sense of authenticity to the world. For others, however, it created moments that felt unintentionally awkward and unbearable to watch. But personally though, I have always found it to be rather charming. Not because having the accents necessarily makes the perfect sense, but because of the lengths the developers were willing to go just to give the world a little extra personality. One of the cast, Corey Walgreen, delivers a particularly memorable performance as Jeanne. She captures the fiery determination and stubborn resolve often associated with the historical Jeanne perfectly. Alongside her is Yuri Lowenthal, a voice actor who by this point has appeared in what feels like nearly every major video game franchise. Here, he voices Roger, an amnesiac refugee serving as Jeanne's early companion alongside Liane, who is voiced by Renee Bell. Ultimately, the voice direction in Jeanne d'Arc were received with mixed opinions. Some people love its inclusion, with some others rather put off by it. But hey, for what it's worth, you don't really see developers putting in such effort nowadays. Story-wise, at first glance, Jeanne d'Arc appears to be a fairly straightforward retelling of Joan of Arc, with many of the historical events associated with Jeanne present and accounted for. From her rise as a humble farmer's daughter, the campaign she took part in during the later stages of the 100 Years' War, to her capture and her eventual execution at the hands of the English, with but a small twist. As I briefly mentioned earlier, the world of Jeanne d'Arc is not purely historical. Humans do not stand alone in this world. But unseen to all behind the chaos of war, something else is pulling the strings. An ancient evil was manipulating events from the shadows. More on that later on. But having interesting voice acting and storytelling alone won't be enough to make Jeanne d'Arc stand out among other tactical RPGs. The gameplay may appear fairly simple. You take control of a small group of units in a grid-based battlefield, but once the system begins to unfold, the game reveals a surprising level of depth. Mechanics such as directional attacks, burning auras, and unified guard encourage players to think not only about positioning, but also to think aggressively. Unlike many tactical RPGs that reward slow and methodical gameplay, Jeanne d'Arc, more often than not, encourages players to act quickly. Since each stage is limited by a set amount of turns, once the turn limit has been reached, the battle ends in your failure. In other words, you are constantly racing against the clock to reach your objective. The objectives can range from being fairly simple, like defeating every enemy on the field, but at times, the conditions could become much more demanding. Jeanne d'Arc frequently rewards players who are willing to play aggressively. Much like the historical Joan of Arc herself, bold actions on the battlefield often lead to the greatest victories. A prime example of this can be seen through the burning aura mechanic. Each time a unit strikes an enemy, a small field of flames appears directly behind the target. If another ally steps into that burning field, their next attack deals increased damage, on top of already receiving additional bonus gained from attacking an enemy's flank. This simple interaction encourages players to chain attacks together, but through careful positioning and proper understanding of the game's base mechanic, you will also be able to stack multiple burning auras on top of one another, enough to deal some pretty serious damage, even to boss enemies, which is exactly what the game wants you to do. Another mechanic that supports this aggressive design is their armlet transformation. Fairly early in the game, you gain access to magical armlets, artifacts that allow certain characters to temporarily transform. During this state, the character equips what appears to be a holy armor, which dramatically increase their combat abilities and grant them access to powerful exclusive skills, albeit only for 2 to 3 turns, with some more powerful transformation lasting only a single turn. These mechanics are only a small glimpse of the system that defines Jeanne d'Arc's combat. To understand how they all work together, we need to take a closer look at the game's core gameplay system. At the center of it all, Jeanne d'Arc is played on a grid-based battlefield where positioning and numbers dictates everything. Each unit is allowed to act once per turn, to move, attack, or to use items and skills. But by ending their turn with wait, you could set the direction they face. This is to take into account the directional attack mechanic. Throughout the journey, you will gain new allies as per standard RPG progression system. But unlike many RPGs, classes and stat lines in Jeanne d'Arc are fixed. Each character is tied to a specific weapon type. They may wield swords, spears, axes, and that defines their class. With spears, you are able to strike from 2 tiles away and even pierce through 2 enemies at once. Axes hit hard, but at the cost of lower accuracy. You can even slot in passives that sacrifice defenses for higher attack, further highlighting their magic glacier tendencies. There are many more, but I will introduce them as they get added into the party. Now, while classes and stat lines are fixed, you are still allowed some leeway in unit customization. You are free to equip weapons and skills in the preparation menu, and whenever you stop by a town, you will be able to access the local shop to stock up on items. Now, regarding the skill system, it's divided into 4 types. Some grant powerful attacks based on weapon types, others allow access to a wide variety of spells, and some enhance your units passively. Through the skill slot system, you can create specialized roles within your party. Liane, for example, isn't suitable for the front line. Her physical stats fall short compared to Jeanne. But if you pay attention, her magical growth is far higher than anyone else available in the early parts of the game, making her surprisingly effective as a pseudo-mage, even after a proper mage joined the party. Lastly, there's Unified Guard, a damage reduction mechanic where the number of nearby allies help reduce incoming damage, further reinforcing the mindset of united we stand, divided we fall. Unless you're someone with the armlet, of course. Previously, I have briefly explained how this armlet's transformation work. Now, let's get into why it's so devastatingly powerful. Each time you transform, you are automatically granted a passive skill known as Godspeed. This effect is very destructive. Each time they slay an enemy, they immediately gain another turn, and there is no limit to how many times this effect can trigger. In the right situation, this allows a character like Jeanne to single-handedly carve through an entire formation of enemies in one single chain. A single transformation could easily turn the tide of the battle, should it be not in your favor. The only thing preventing players from abusing this ability is the Armlet's charge requirement, which typically takes around 3 turns to activate. Now with the gameplay system fully covered, let's finally delve into the story. The game opens with Jeanne and Liane amidst a festival in Domrémy, a small village located in northeastern France. Historically, Joan of Arc lived here with her family for most of her life. Her father was a farmer who owned roughly 50 acres of land, but to supplement his income, he also acts as a village official. His duty was to collect taxes and head the local watchman. Jeanne was the youngest among her siblings, of which she has 3 older brothers and 1 older sister. Much of her early life was spent helping around the family farm, spinning wool and receiving religious education from her mother, Isabelle Romy. In-game, however, no mention of her siblings was made, so it's likely this depiction was an only child. That said, she wasn't entirely alone. By her side is Liane, her childhood friend, sweet but meek in temperament, a direct contrast to Jeanne, who is fierce and headstrong. Both were instructed to deliver some medicinal herb to a nearby church, but it was there that she had an encounter with destiny. Atop a horse was a wounded knight, seemingly dead, but when Jeanne approaches, something mystical happened.
What's in that bag?
No, Jeanne, leave it be. Oh, Jeanne! Your wrist! It's glowing! armies! Look! You might be hurt!
An armlet. What is it? And where did it appear from?
An armlet?
But the magical armlet latching itself onto her arm was only the beginning. Hidden within the compartment of the horse saddle was a giant toad, which looked strangely human. It was then the demon's attack. Cornered, she heard a voice, telling her to pick up the sword and fight back. And with that, her journey truly begins. The first stage always serves as a tutorial in any games, and this is no different. Your only objective is to slay the 3 orcs present on the map. Simple enough really. It's meant to teach you the game's basic on positioning and directional attack. After dispatching the orcs, you regroup with Roger, the town's recluse, who only joined the community after being found by Jeanne's father wandering the woods. Hearing a scream, they immediately headed back to the village, which much to their horror has been set ablaze. In 1425, the village Domrémy was raided by their fellow Frenchmen, the Burgundians. They were a French faction allied with the English during the 100 Years' War, and opposing them were the Armlets, supporters of Charles VII's claim to the French throne. France was already unstable at the time, and this political divide eventually escalated into a civil war. Domrémy was situated within land occupied by the English and surrounded by the Burgundians. But despite being located deep within enemy territory, Domrémy largely remained loyal to their Armlets' cause. This, however, only drew further ire from the Burgundians, eventually leading to an attack on the village. The inhabitants, including Jeanne and her family, managed to flee to the nearby town of Neufchâteau, only because they were warned of the attack. They returned weeks later to burn down homes and empty barns. This only led to further anti-English sentiments from the villagers, claiming peace will only come when the English are expelled from the lands. No one took this harder than Jeanne herself. The village was deserted. Not a single body could be found in the streets. There, they finally encountered the culprit, a single English officer leading a pack of demons, looking for something, or rather, someone. This is where the armlet first revealed its power. Throughout the entire ordeal, the voice had been calling out to Jeanne, growing more coherent each time, until it gave one final command: to hold the armlet aloft for her friend's sake. From that point onward, the stage becomes heavily tilted in the player's favor, quite literally too. The enemies are arranged almost perfectly for chaining Godspeed, straight toward the English officer. It serves as the first proper demonstration of how broken armlet bearers truly are, giving you a taste of absolute power, a glimpse of what is possible. With that, we end this chapter in a Pyrrhic victory for our trio. Revisiting the opening segment again as an adult, you really begin to appreciate the amount of detail poured into it. The level design and art direction are easily some of the most exceptional for a PlayStation Portable. Each map is designed to be distinct, with the experience further enhanced by the soundtrack composed by Takeshi Inoue. Even during the years I stopped playing the game, I could still recall the vivid nighttime shading of the chapel in the woods, contrasted by the warm orange glow of Domrémy in flames. Overall, it serves as an excellent introduction to the world of Jeanne d'Arc. Before we continue on, Let me briefly explain what the 100 Years' War actually was. At its core, it was a massive dynastic struggle over who possessed the legitimate right to the French throne. In 1328, King Charles IV of France died without leaving behind a son or brother. However, he did leave a nephew through his sister Isabella, who had married King Edward II of England. That nephew was Edward III. By blood, Edward was the closest relative. Yet the French nobles rejected his claim. Their argument was simple. Women could neither inherit the French throne nor pass that right to their children. As a result, the crown was passed to Philip of Valois, who became King Philip VI of France. For a time, the issue remained unresolved, but disputes over land and authority continued to strain relations between England and France. Eventually, Edward III revived his claim to the French throne, this time by force. Despite its name, the 100 Years' War was not one continuous conflict. Instead, it was a series of campaigns, truces, and temporary periods of peace spread across more than a century. Realistically, neither kingdom could afford to wage a non-stop war for that long. The conflict would flare up again in 1415, during the reign of Henry V of England. His campaign proved remarkably successful. After years of victories, Henry forced Charles VI of France to recognize him as both regent and heir to the French throne through the Treaty of Troyes. The agreement effectively disinherited Charles V's own son, Charles the Dauphin, who was already facing rumors questioning both the legitimacy of his birth and his involvement in the assassination of the Duke of Burgundy. Yet Henry's triumph would be short-lived. In 1422, he died from illness while campaigning in France. Only a few months later, Charles VI also passed away. The result was yet another succession crisis. Henry's son, Henry VI, was only 2 years old at the time. Unable to rule for himself, his uncle John, the Duke of Bedford, assumed the role of regent and became responsible for preserving England's claim to France. It is here that our story begins. Several years before the event of the game, there was a war that devastated most of the continent. A large-scale invasion from another realm led by the demon lord, Gilvarot, and his servants, the Four Reapers. It was an event that united the world's inhabitants against a common enemy. The elves and dwarves forged 5 magical armlets and bestowed them upon human champions to use during the war, while the beast folk, or as they are known here, the Tyrians, bolstered much of their fighting force with their robust strength. After a long, arduous campaign, they were able to seal Gilvarot away through the combined power of the armlets, which then leads to the present day. Henry VI was thrust into a world of political intrigue at the tender age of 2, his only solace being his uncle, the Duke of Bedford, who took the role of regent until Henry is of age to take the throne. Being the young prince's sole remaining family, the Duke often makes the time to tell bedtime stories to his nephew. From stories about his father to fantastical tales of war fought long in the past. All seemed well until one night when the Duke put his plot into motion. A ritual designed to release Gilvarot from its prison and bind it to a human vessel, that recipient being none other than his beloved nephew. Luther, one of the armlet bearers from the war, caught wind of the ritual and intervenes, briefly clashing with Bedford, who seemingly holds the upper hand in their battle. Through the power of his armlet, Luther managed to land a blow that seemingly freed the prince from Gilvarot's influence. However, the attack left him exposed. Before he could react, Bedford struck back, and Luther himself was consumed by the ritual. The prince woke up not long after, but it's clear he is no longer himself. With Henry possessed, a new age of tyranny had begun. Amidst the ruins of Domrémy, our trio made the decision to go to Feucouleurs, a French war camp located close to the town of Chateau, where they intend to join the French army. The captain of the garrison, is Robert Baudricourt, who rejected Jeanne's appeal. But then, news of another English attack arrived. This time, the target was the town Neufchâteau. Unlike Domrémy, corpses littered the streets. It was clear the local militia was no match for the English forces. On the orders of Baudricourt, both Jeanne de Masse and Bertrand de Poulengy were dispatched onto the field. Their instruction was to support Jeanne and her party, who had rushed out the moment she heard the news. In real life, these two were among Jeanne's earliest supporters. It was through their backing that she eventually persuaded Baudricourt to support her cause and have her escorted to the Dauphin. Though the party succeeded in driving out the enemy, they arrived far too late to actually save anyone, as the last of the survivors had died from their own wounds, with the other dying from his own despair, watching his beloved die by the hands of the English. Again, no one took this harder than Jeanne, who blamed herself for failing to act sooner, for the crime of simply not being better, even though there was really nothing they could have done. Demoralized and lashing out, she received yet another message, this time telling her to go to the city of Nancy, located in northeastern France, within the region of Lorraine. It was around 1429, at the start of Jeanne's journey, that she received a summons to Nancy. Apparently, the Duke had heard news of a girl blessed by God staying in Vaucouleurs and thought she might cure him of his illness, which amounted to nothing. John will even chastise the Duke for keeping a mistress while his wife, Margaret, is still alive. Despite it all, the Duke will provide John with an armed escort meant to safeguard her journey to Chinon, something she has been pestering Baudricourt for since her arrival in Vaucouleurs, as her visions dictated that, for France to be free, Charles the Dauphin must be crowned king. But to get to Nancy, Jeanne must travel northeast through the forest of Fraud, where she will encounter a French noble along with his companion under attack by pursuing English forces. That man was Gilles de Rais. Historically, Gilles will become one of Jeanne's most prominent military companions, serving alongside her during some of the most important campaigns of her career. For this stage, you are to eliminate the enemy forces while keeping Gilles alive, which is honestly way more difficult than it sounds. Gilles and his companion begins isolated on the opposite side of the map, surrounded by enemies and entirely controlled by the AI. A few well-placed attacks, or worse, a critical hit, can easily end the mission before you ever reach them. The way I used to get through this stage is by brute forcing my way to their position, because I thought if you could use healing items on your fellow party, then surely you can use it on allied units too, right? Well, I was proven right after multiple trial and error attempts to reach their position. Entirely unaware, there was a much easier solution that the game had already given you the tools for 2 stages back. You are given the Heal skill stone as a reward for completing the stage Domrémy Ablaze. You can equip it on just about anyone, but I recommend Liane because of her pseudo-mage status. With this, you can simply heal from a distance, which made it so much easier to keep Gilles alive while the rest of your force pushes across the stage. One detail worth noting is that if Jeanne transformed during the battle, Gilles will comment that she possesses the same power he does. It's a small moment, but one that quietly foreshadows his later importance. You encounter Gilles again during your visit to the Duke of Lorraine, albeit only briefly within the Duke's residence. There, he gives Jeanne the encouragement she needs to fully commit to her journey. Because for all the bravado that Jeanne has shown since the beginning, she was quietly hiding a version of herself not many have seen, one that was doubting her own purpose. This is where the game's interpretation of Jeanne begins to diverge from the historical Joan of Arc. Jeanne was a deeply devout Catholic, whose faith shaped nearly every aspect of her life. She will later claim to have received visions from people she identified as saints. Whether the visions was legitimate or merely a sign of mental illness, you cannot deny her resolute faith was charismatic enough to convince actual armies and leaders to follow her. On the other hand, Jeanne does not possess that same devotion. Sure, she is religious, but not to the same extent as her historical counterpart. What ultimately drives her was anger at the face of injustice, anger at the English for daring to burn her home and possibly bring harm to everyone she holds dear. But when the smoke fades and she is left face to face with the calling from destiny, Jeanne is left with self-doubt. Because the meeting with the Duke made one thing clear. People had already begun placing their hopes on Jeanne, naming her La Pucelle, meaning the maiden in French, which is John's historical title. Even Gilles, despite having only just met her, seemed convinced that Jeanne was the right person for the task of saving France. This small moment hardened Jeanne's resolve and solidified the trio's next objective. Travel to Chinon, where Charles the Dauphin was hiding, and help place the rightful King of France upon his throne. For the journey to Chinon, the Duke assigns 2 knights as Jeanne's escort. The first is Colette, a dastardly thief with more confidence than manners. The second is Marcel, an earnest young knight who also served as your first dedicated ranged unit. What separates Jeanne and her destination is the Sawyer Valley, a lush green landscape separated by rivers and hills that you must cross. But the terrain is not the only obstacle she will face, for these hills are defended by an old adversary of the French, who goes by the name John Talbot, nicknamed Old Talbot and the Terror of the French. He was one of England's most respected commanders during the later stages of the 100 Years' War. Serving under the Duke of Bedford, Talbot became one of England's foremost military commanders in the war, and an important pillar supporting England's claim to the French throne. You will encounter him several times throughout the game. He essentially serves as Jeanne's recurring rival, challenging her both in military might and ideology. That said, welcome to your first escape map. Your goal is to ensure all of your party reaches the yellow marked spot on the opposite side of the stage, with 0 casualties. The path forward is guarded by enemy snipers, lizardmen, and heavy-hitting beastfolks, with the very last line being defended by Talbot himself, who can easily slaughter your party if you are not careful. If you succeed, the party continues fleeing south until they reach Orléans Hill, where they stop for a brief moment to catch their breath. Believing they had finally outrun Talbot, they are caught completely off guard when he reveals he has been one step ahead all along, cutting off the only path forward. With no way around, you are forced to fight your way through despite the overwhelming enemy numbers, as fleeing is no longer an option. Fortunately, a certain someone has been tailing your group from a distance and had come to help out. Gilles enters the field as an ally after a single turn pass. The first thing he does upon entering the battlefield is to reveal himself to be another armlet bearer, confirming what the game had quietly hinted at during your previous encounter. His timely arrival completely changes the tide of the battle, because until that moment, Talbot had only accounted for Jeanne. Suddenly, he finds himself facing 2 armlet bearers instead of 1. By this point, the game expects you to understand how devastating chain guard speed can be. With 2 armlet bearers fighting side by side, the odds are now in your favor, even if Gilles is still controlled by the AI. The stage ends with Talbot's defeat, but this will be the last time you saw him. The man is as relentless as his historical counterpart, fighting not for England's glory, but rather for an answer to a question we aren't privy to yet. With Talbot driven back, the road to Chinon finally lies open. Jeanne is now one step closer to meeting the Dauphin. Now, remember when I mentioned that the people of France had already begun placing their hopes on Jeanne? Well, as it turns out, news of a traveling maiden blessed by God had already reached the Dauphin, so too had word of her journey to meet him. Naturally, the Dauphin wasn't about to accept such claims at face value. Instead, he decided to put Jeanne to the test. He will dress himself the same as the other nobles and hide amongst them. If it is by God's will that Jeanne is sent to liberate France and crown him king, then surely she will recognize the king she is supposed to crown. With only a cryptic clue from Gilles about the color of noble blood, Jeanne marched in the fortress mid-celebration. If Charles wishes to test the legitimacy of her claim, then she will rise up to the task.
Jeanne, look, that man in red. Remember what Gilles said. The color of royal blood. Blood is red. He has to be the Dauphin.
No, I don't think so.
Huh? Then, who is?
Merci la coupe.
Gentle Dauphin, my name is Jeanne, la Tourelles.
A miracle!
According to historical accounts, it is said that Charles had set up a trap by placing an impostor onto his seat, while he blended with the other nobles. Not only did Jeanne walk past the impostor, she went straight toward Charles in hiding and declared that God had chosen him as king. Shortly after, they held a private conversation. According to later accounts, Jeanne revealed details of a deeply personal prayer Charles had made regarding the legitimacy of his birth and his claim to the throne. Fully convinced now, the Dauphin at last chose to place his trust on Jeanne, gifting her a squadron of soldiers and a suit of armor to wear in battle. Their first mission is to lift the siege on Orléans, a major French city on the verge of being taken over by the English. Orléans was the last major stronghold that is loyal to the French crown. Should the English take hold of it, the war would have ended with utter English victory. But the arrival of Joan of Arc turned the situation around. Before, the city had been under siege for 7 long months. Then Jeanne arrived, bringing hope to an otherwise bleak situation. But let's pause for a moment before we press on to the campaign that immortalized Joan of Arc in history. Let's take some time to explore 2 of Jeanne's closest companions. Because while Jeanne may be the one driving the story forward, she is by no means the only lead will be flowing throughout the game. While Jeanne is impulsive and often driven by righteous anger, Liane is cautious and gentle by nature. More than once, she questions whether any of this is worth risking their lives over. What's more is that she is terrified of being left behind. With Jeanne determined to continue, and Roger unwilling to leave her side, Liane quietly realizes that there's no going back now. Speaking of Roger, who is a very interesting case. He was introduced as an amnesiac recluse who stumbled onto Domrémy while wandering on his own. Little is known about him, not even his age. His role in the trio is to essentially serve as the voice of reason to Jeanne's otherwise brash personality, often clashing with Jeanne when he thinks she is going way over the line. Occasionally though, you are given a brief look into his past. In between cutscenes, you are treated to a nightmare sequence, showing Roger strapped to an operating table for reasons yet unknown. I won't spoil anything the game hasn't shown you yet, but if you look closely, you'll notice the familiar lab equipments from the opening cutscene and Bedford's shrouded figure in Roger's memory. By the latest nightmare, however, we finally caught a glimpse of something staring back from the darkness. A monstrous demon of some kind, which, judging by Bedford's involvement in his nightmares, suggests that Roger might have had to endure the same thing as Henry. What comes of this possession, however, will only be fully explored in the latter half of the game. But for the moment, Jeanne has a more pressing concern to attend to, because if Orléans were to actually fall, this might just be it for the French. In order to relieve the siege on Orléans, you only need to have Jeanne reach the front gate, as shown by the yellow marker. Your path to said gate is obstructed by a wide flowing river that hinders your mobility, with guards stationed along the riverbank. All of which are nothing that armlet bearers are unable to handle. But your biggest mistake will be thinking one armlet bearer can solve everything alone. Because speaking from personal experience, it doesn't always work out well. Starting from this campaign, Gilles officially joins your party, serving as Jeanne's advisor and strategist for the battles ahead. He cuts an imposing figure. By the time Jeanne first met him, Gilles is already an experienced commander and one of the wealthiest lords in western France. That said, Gilles won't be the only noteworthy name that joins you, because Laire, another renowned French commander, will be under your command alongside his fictional companion, Rufus. Much like Gilles, Laire had been a very distinguished commander prior to joining Jeanne's army. His birth name was Etienne de Vignoles. Laire was merely a nickname he gained from his time serving in the military. In life, he was one of Jeanne's fiercest captains. History will remember him as an aggressive battlefield commander whose reputation was borderline legendary. Therefore, the game decides to reflect that reputation by making him one of your strongest frontline fighters from the moment he joins. Laire and Rufus's inclusion to the party marks the first time non-human units joins the group, as these two are part of the proud Tyrian race. Although, their inclusion along with Gilles' exposes what I believe is Jeanne d'Arc's biggest gameplay flaw. In gameplay terms, Gilles is essentially a better Jeanne de Masse in regards to stats and utility, with the main thing being his status as another armlet wielder. The game by design only allows you to deploy a certain number of units per stage, usually capping off at 5 or 6. This presents a problem that tactical RPGs had already begun solving through more flexible class systems. The problem isn't Gilles himself, it's that Jeanne d'Arc frequently introduces new characters who occupy the same exact battlefield role as the older ones, while giving you fewer deployment slots than party members. You'll notice the same problem a couple chapters back when Bertrand was introduced. By that point, your party already have 3 swordsmen within the group. Adding another is simply redundant, especially when you don't have the room to accommodate them due to deployment limit. It's the same case with Laire and Rufus, albeit to a lesser extent because both lack the armlets. A proper job system could have addressed much of this issue, but for reasons yet unknown, Level 5 decided not to. One last thing before we carry on, let me introduce you to the absolute strongest character in game, surpassing all the armlet bearers in raw power. He doesn't look like much. In fact, many first-time players, including myself, bench him almost immediately. Rufus is someone whose true value depends on how willing you are to invest in him early. He possesses the largest growth rate in both HP and physical attack. Depending on how you build him, he can be a devastating card to have. At first, you may be put off by his lackluster performance, but make no mistake, this beast is merely a late bloomer. His potential surpassed even Laire, who is based on a famous war hero despite his terrible initial showing. While the game simplifies the campaign, history unfolded somewhat differently. Joan of Arc and her troops entered the city on April 29, 1429. Despite the English siege lines, Jeanne and her convoy were able to successfully enter the city, bringing with them necessary supplies meant for the city defenders after 7 long months of the English forcing the city into starvation. Her actions brought a surge of morale to the army, while her presence was what emboldened them to take the next step. By following her lead, Jeanne urged an aggressive offensive against the English fortifications surrounding the city, which marks their hold over the region. It's one thing I appreciated far more after learning about the actual campaign. Rather than reduce the Siege of Orleans to a single climatic battle, Level 5 opted to recreate the campaign fought across 3 consecutive battles, which, after learning about the actual campaign, makes reality seems even more absurd. Because the arrival of Joan of Arc ended the 7-month siege in a matter of days. On the 4th of May, the entire platoon left without notifying Jeanne of their plans to take the Bastille of St. Loup. Furious, she immediately rode out with her banner the moment she learned of the attack, arriving just as the Armlets were retreating from the failed assault. Her presence alone reversed the momentum. Your first conquest, the Bastille of St. Loup, is fairly straightforward. You are to take control of the fortress by routing every enemy within. The real danger, however, comes from the archers lining the high ground. Push too aggressively, and your advance quickly turns into target practice for the enemy archers. Overall, the stage itself isn't particularly memorable, but it does reward you with something far more significant. It's a new gem meant for Jeanne's armlet. With this, you now have access to one more transformation for Jeanne, this one being the Gem of Goulas. With only a day's rest, Jeanne and her troops quickly move on to the next fortress, determined not to lose the momentum they had gained. Their next target is now the Les Augustins, a far more formidable fortress than Saint Loup. Unlike Saint Loup's wooden defense, Les Augustins is protected by thick stone walls. A direct assault won't be nearly as simple, especially with the gates sealed shut. And guarding Les Augustins is Talbot himself. His presence in the battlefield along with Jeanne's impulsiveness immediately creates a problem during the assault.
Fight for France! The enemy's defenses are crumbling! Have no fear! Look upon this banner and have faith! Soldiers! I vow we will take this fortress! Band together and follow me in! Our victory is preordained by God himself!
No, Jeanne! Get that from there! You're a sitting duck!
I will not! Or would you have me be a lame duck and abandon France? Hold firm the lines! Send the rats back to England!
Jeanne, no! Jeanne!
For her recklessness, Jeanne suffered a rather serious injury in between her neck and shoulder, a fatal wound at the time, with a minuscule chance of recovery, as the arrow struck one of the worst places it possibly could have. The neck and shoulder house several major arteries, which makes surviving the initial wound only the first hurdle. Treating the wound was where the real gamble began. But for Jeanne, the situation was looking rather dire. She was just carried fresh off the battlefield back to their encampment and in urgent need for medical care. Her injury was severe, and she was losing a significant amount of blood. One wrong move, or any move at all, might just spell the end of her legend early. Her troops did their best to dress her wound, using what little knowledge they have of first-aid care, while the assault on the fort carried on. At this point, only a divine act of God can save her now. That just happened. But something to note though, because when I was doing research for the video, I learned that while Joan of Arc did in fact receive this exact injury during the campaign, it didn't actually happen until much later during their assault on the Tourelles, the supposed impregnable fortress. Level 5 never explained the reason for this change, and it ultimately led to nowhere. So, this is just me sharing cool little tidbit with you all. The assault on the Les Augustins is where I find the tactical aspect of Jeanne d'Arc shines the brightest. Because the great thing about this map is that you really can go wrong with your strategy. For the assault, you're expected to breach inside and rout the enemy troops, with Talbot helming the defenses. There are several ways to breach the fortress. You can brute force your way in by smashing the front gate wide open and mount a full frontal assault. Or you can climb up a siege ladder and have your troops bail in close narrow space to gain grounds within the fort. There is also a lever within you can pull down to open the gate. Knowing this, you can split your troops and work both options together. Once your party reaches the fortress gate, the rest of the map is nothing short of straightforward, especially since you have a brand new toy I'm sure you have been dying to try out. Jeanne now has two transformation options to choose from. The first being the Gem of Argent, which you're probably already accustomed to. Then there's the Gem of Goulas, which is a clear step up from Jeanne's original transformation. Visually, it doesn't look that much different from the first transformation, aside from the pink coloration, but it does grant you a massive boost in firepower, though it requires an extra turn to charge, bringing the count up to 4. If I hadn't made it clear by now, you can actually gain more transformation options for your armored barrels by progressing through the story. Some are locked behind bonus stages, and some are hidden as treasure within the story map that can be missed permanently. Questionable design, I know. Drove me crazy the first time I realized it, but I digress. With Talbot defeated and the defenders driven out, it looked as though Les Augustins had finally fallen. Except it hadn't. Talbot's retreat had been a ploy from the very beginning. While the French believed the fortress was secure, Talbot quietly led his men back inside under the cover of night, turning their hard-earned victory into an ambush, forcing Jeanne to defend a position she just fought to capture. And so, a battle that began as an offensive suddenly becomes a desperate defense. But that day, just after Jeanne's initial victory and capture of Les Augustins, we see a scene between Roger and Liane back in the encampment. The two had remained behind after Roger exhausted himself doing whatever he did for Jeanne to recover. This is reflected in gameplay, as both temporarily leave your party for the entire duration of the assault on the Augustins. With just the two of them left, the need for pretenses was over. Liane finally confronted the one thing Roger had been keeping quiet about. This whole time, Roger wasn't fighting for France. He wasn't even fighting because he believed in Jeanne's mission or supposed calling from the heavens. But rather, he was fighting because he loved her. Perhaps those feelings were exactly what awakened the beast sleeping inside him. Unfortunately for Roger, Jeanne's growing reliance on Gilles only worsened his insecurities. Now, whenever she found herself at a crossroads, it was Gilles she turned to. Not only is he an experienced commander, he had looked like a rival, someone far more established than he was. But whether Gilles truly harbored feelings for Jeanne is never made entirely clear. What mattered the most, however, was that Roger believed he did. This won't be the last time these feelings shape the story, but for now, Les Augustins awaits. Despite how I initially painted the whole situation, the Augustins was actually far easier to defend than I made it out to be. Mechanically speaking, the whole map is basically an inverse of the scenario from earlier. Only this time, you're the one under siege, and your enemies are already winning the walls. By the end of the night, Les Augustins had finally and truly fallen. Although, one thing Talbot says at the start of the battle did stick out, claiming that the invasion was justified because of what the French did to them in the past. That they were simply reclaiming what they lost, which is an odd thing to say. His claim doesn't correspond to some straightforward historical reality in which England was simply reclaiming France, unless he was referring to the Treaty of Tourelles signed just a couple of years prior, where it states the English has a legitimate claim to the French throne, as agreed by the late French king himself. Whether that claim was actually legitimate or not is a much more complicated question. Remember, Charles VI, in his twilight years, was supposedly not right in the head. With Les Augustins finally secured, the French had cleared 2 of the 3 English strongholds surrounding Orleans. Only one remained, but before the game allows us to march onto the Tourelles, it offers us one final stop. Our suspiciously human-looking frog, Quizzes, returns. This time, to introduce one of Jeanne d'Arc's more interesting progression system, skill binding. By combining 2 different skills, you can create a new one, opening up a much wider range of skill stones to use. You can even obtain skills normally reserved for the late game much earlier, although they still have minimum level requirements. The game clearly expects you have spent some time experimenting with these new combinations, because the next assault will be the most demanding battle of the entire campaign. The battle for the Tourelles is comprised of 2 stages, forming a gauntlet. You cannot return to the world map until the entire fortress has been captured. So, best to stock up on those healing items before you march on, because you're gonna have a horrible time otherwise. Regardless, the stage is now set for the assault on the Englishmen's stronghold over Orleans. With one final rousing speech from Jeanne, our troops are now fully prepared to commence their final assault of the campaign. They left the war camp in one furious charge, until only Liane remained, who seemed strangely hesitant about the whole thing. I wonder why. The Tourelles is where the game's fantasy elements started to come to the forefront, because this entire map looked as though it belonged to an entirely different RPG. The whole place is cast in this purple tinge that makes you feel as though you have stumbled into something you shouldn't have. Out of every stage you have come across, it certainly feels the most out of place. And mind you, this is just the first map. Before the assault proper can take place, you must first breach through the gates and slay the commander guarding the bridge leading to the main fortress, William Glassdale. The path to said bridge is heavily defended by knights and gargoyle enemies we have never seen before, all higher level than those defending the Augustins, but nothing we should be able to handle. Oh, it's one of those stages. Yes, you're not allowed to let even a single unit die in battle, which is an interesting design decision, considering we are in a map with enemies that can spawn and act mid-turn. But you know what? Why not? With Glassdale defeated, we can now take on the Tourelles proper. But first... Oh gee, I would have appreciated the warning more had it been before I attacked the Tourelles. This is it. The finale of the Orleans campaign. Compared to the previous stages, the final assault doesn't introduce many new tactical ideas. Instead, it serves as a campaign's payoff. One final hurrah before history catches up and Orleans is finally free. Hell, there was even the name of the stage. Standing in their way once more is Talbot, who seemed equally determined to settle the score, after suffering loss after loss. This is where he decided to make his last stand against the supposed witch who had risen from the dead. Map design-wise, the level is a bunch of intertwining single-file staircases. What's more is that every path is linear. Your troops cannot confront Talbot directly unless they travel up those narrow staircases all the way to the top. But to make it to the top, they'll need to move past Talbot's entire squadron of knights, taking up much of the already limited tiles. Even the Armlets transformation will be of much help in these narrow spaces, since chaining Godspeed requires some level of group coordination, which is a tad bit harder to execute here. Narratively, the whole level design actually makes sense when you consider it from Talbot's perspective. After repeatedly losing to Jeanne's crew, Talbot had finally learned what made him so dangerous. Having seen the Armlets' power firsthand, he knew he'll have to adjust the battlefield accordingly. So he did, by introducing narrow spaces to strip away their mobility, making them work harder for each tile of the ground they claim, turning them into easy targets for archers and mages positioned beyond their reach, unless you brought ranged troops of your own. That said, I don't know whether level 5 intended you to interpret it that way, but the more I thought about it, the more sense it made, especially since this will be the last time you see Talbot have an active role in anything. He didn't die, mind you. In fact, he will continue fighting in the war for many years to come, only defeated and killed during the Battle of Castillon on 17 July 1453. Even after his death, he was still greatly honored by both the English and the French, enough for the victorious French generals to raise a monument to Talbot in the field where he had perished. Following his defeat in the Tourelles, both he and Jeanne shared one last exchange where he asked the supposed Holy Maiden one question. just one, but it made me look at this entire conflict differently. Why did God choose France to be victorious, and not England? At first glance, the answer seems rather obvious, but from what we now know about actual history, the harder it became to answer. Because from the French perspective, John's victories seemed like proof that God had finally chosen their side. After all, how on earth do you explain the French breaking a 7-month siege within days of the arrival of one self-proclaimed messenger of God? But from the English perspective, they were not simply invading France for the sake of conquest. They had their own claim to the French throne, one that had been formally recognized by the Treaty of Tourelles. So if both sides believed they had a legitimate claim, and both believed God was on their side, why did God choose France? That question sailed right past me when I was young. I didn't appreciate it nearly enough. But after learning more about the 100 Years' War, how it started and where it eventually led, I began to realize how much the way we remember this conflict was shaped by who ultimately won. I'm almost certain that the real Talbot never asked John that question, but that doesn't mean the same question wasn't being asked on the English side. If the English truly believed their claim to France was legitimate, then surely an uncomfortable question remained. If God was on our side, then why are we losing? 4 months ago, when I started working on this video, I thought this section will be fairly straightforward. Jeanne arrives, Orléans is liberated, and we move on. It turns out, the story had considerably more to say than I thought it did. But Orléans was never the end of Jeanne's journey. If anything, much like it was for her historical counterpart, it is merely the beginning. With Orléans freed, the momentum had finally shifted in France's favor. Jeanne had one final thing to accomplish before the Dauphin could claim the throne: to retake the city of Reims, where kings are crowned. The decision to march to Reims was not made lightly. By 1415, following Henry V's victory at the Battle of Agincourt, much of northern France had fallen into English hands. Reims itself was situated deep behind enemy lines, making the decision to march there a considerable risk. But for Charles, the decision meant everything. His mother, Isabel of Bavaria, had become the subject of vicious rumors some time after his birth, including accusations that she had been unfaithful to her husband and even involved in an affair with her brother-in-law, Louis I. Whether any of those accusations were true is another matter entirely. But for Charles, the damage had been severe enough to fuel his lifelong self-doubt. Things took a turn for the worse following the Treaty of Troyes. His mentally ill father had disinherited him from the line of succession in favor of Henry V's line, casting him even further into despair. He had reportedly made his way to a nearby chapel early in the morning, where he prayed in despair, asking God whether he was truly his father's legitimate heir, because if so, he'll defend his crown to the bitter end. But if not, then he only asked for safe passage for his exile, either in Spain or Scotland, both being historic allies of France. It will be some time before he received his answer, in the form of a peasant girl claiming to be God's envoy. Their exchange was brief, but for Charles, it had been enough to ease some of his doubts. And now, with John's claims seemingly vindicated, Charles finally took the plunge and put the rest of his doubts to rest. Throughout French history, Reims was the traditional site where French monarchs were crowned. The coronation involved the king being anointed with sacred oil from the holy ampulla, which represents the sovereign's God-given right to rule. With all that said, if Charles wished for his royal authority to be publicly recognized, then Reims was where he needed to go. With the Holy Maiden at his side, surely nothing can go wrong.
Jeanne, no! No! Jeanne!
Oh dear, things can go wrong after all. And unfortunately, this is where I have to end things off for now. We have barely scratched the surface of John's legend, but this is where I feel the most comfortable ending the video. It's been 4 months since I started this project. My initial plan was to release the retrospective as one complete video, but the deeper I research into the actual history and compare it to the game, the more I realize that it might no longer be possible. And honestly, I'm glad for that. This game defined my childhood. As a kid from Southeast Asia, you can probably imagine my surprise when I eventually discovered that Jeanne d'Arc was a real person. That so much of what I experienced in this game had a basis in actual history. Well, maybe not the fantasy elements, but you get what I mean. So it only makes sense for me to go the extra mile and dig deeper into the parallels between actual history and this semi-fictional game. But to do that properly, I'll have to split the retrospective into 3 parts, corresponding to the game's 3 arcs. Otherwise, this entire project might take me another year or more to complete, and I'd rather not risk losing momentum halfway through. So, if you enjoyed the video, why not leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss the next part. Also, honestly, for some of you that made it to the end, I appreciate you so much. Anyway, see you all next time.